Hi guys. So we're gonna discuss Anne Moore's Life by Roberto Bolaño. I just watched Corinne's presentation, which was great. Um, like really, it gave me a lot of things to think about, so that I can like try to put them together with what I had already prepared in this second reading that I did recently of this story. And then Corinne gave us a very good summary also of Bolaño's life, and especially centered on his quality as an exile, right? So Bolaño is, in that sense, pretty much known as kind of one of the quintessential like postmodern Latin American writers, right? Still kind of like that figure of the writer that is not um, your classical. Think about like the more like North American writer that have to go and do an MFA and like become professionalized and so on. Like Bolaño, more like the figure of, like, as Corinne mentioned, the guy that drops out of school and just lives a lot in order to become a writer, and travels around the world, right? So it almost seems like Herman Melville in those whale ships, right? But it's still like a professional writer, as Corinne mentioned, right? Like writing essays and novels and short stories, right? So very important something to mention about him. He is like very relevant in literature in general, in world literature especially, because of these travels and the way he wrote. And his two biggest novels and most famous ones are The Wild Detectives. And the one that I think Corinne mentioned briefly is the last one that that he wrote, or at least that we know that he wrote and was published posthumously, which is 2006. So if you buy, for example, I have this Spanish version of his text, right? This is where I read it. That is interesting in terms of publications too, because it is by an American company. So I think it's part of Penguin. Yeah, it is Penguin Random House, but it is a Spanish version. And this one will tell you, right? Like here, like he is the author of 2006 because he was a bestseller. And it's a huge novel that talks about traveling around the world and deals with narco, deals with the feminicides in Mexico that are very famous, sadly, and so many things like around the world, right? So kind of like Anne Moore's life, right? But with other characters. So it is a good read. If you guys want to read like an amazing novel about like the world at the end of the 20th century, I do recommend Bolaño. But anyway, I just want to focus on a few things that Corinne mentioned. I just want to piggyback on them, right? And I think Corinne did a great job by underlining for us how a lot of this, what the story is about events, right? Like events and the balancing out of events, right? Like the idea of how many events are there any events that have more weight than others, right? Or are all the events kind of like having the same weight within a life, right? Like it's important to look here at what is the title of the story, right? Like the title of the story is Anne Moore's life, right? Like, so supposedly what it's trying to do is to summarize the life of somebody, right? And Corinne mentioned very, very correctly, right, that it is pretty straightforward, a story that is not told from the perspective of the person that is talking about, from the perspective of the object of the story, right? Like it's not Anne Moore telling her life, but it's a narrator who also was kind of infatuated with Anne Moore, right? He's putting it together not only from from what he saw, from what she told him, right? There is a very conversational tone to it, as Corinne mentioned, but also from diaries, right? And from testimonies, right? Like it has that very kind of like journalistic feel to it, right? Like it seems part of like almost like a news thing, like almost like an obituary, right? Like this happened, this happened, this happened. But that is kind of the important part, right? Like the idea of what the story is about is to summarize a life. It's almost like a biography, right? Like Anne Moore's life, right? Uh, and within that life, like I think that what makes us question, or as Corinne really said in a great way, right? Like because there is a lack of relevancy in the events, right? Like it kind of gives you, in the way it's narrated, an extra time to contemplate and to think, right? And I think this is important in comparison to other narratives that, or especially to the narratives that we're used to, right? Like we're used to narratives, and we talked about this in other sessions of our class, right? We're used to narratives when there are always like apexes, or like where there is like an event that is supposed to close them down, right? So like your classic comedy has to end with a marriage, right? Like marriage is supposed to finish a story, right? Like, and that's why like story fairy tales, right, usually end with and they live happily ever after, right? or in German, and they had many children and so on, right? Like, because they are supposed to, what Corinne mentioned as the normality, right? Like the normal is also always normative, right? So the norm of society in a heterosexual like norm is to find a person with whom you are gonna establish a solid relationship and then to procreate, right, and keep the society going, right? So that's kind of like our idea of like a story as a comedy, right? Like a happy ending story. In terms not of understand comedy not in the sense of funny, but in the sense of a theater play, like a Greek theater play, right? You have comedy and tragedy, comedy ending with a wedding, right, as a happy story, and a tragedy ending with death, right, or with destiny punishing a character, right? So and we're used to those narratives. Like when we watch most of the movies are that, like, right, like the last Star Wars as a comedy. Like there is, even though it's complex because some characters die, there's still like a happy ending, right? And then tragedies is like think about Hamlet, think about like so many movies that end with like the death of somebody and so on, right? So this story, I think, what is very interesting, and Corinne mentions it as well, is that there is no weight, as you put, between like of some events more than others, right? And this you have to think it in terms not only of Anne Moore's life per se, like is any relationship more important than other? Like is Ruben more important than Tony, more important than Paul, right? But also in terms of the events that transpire around her life, right? Like, and some of those are historical events. Like it starts with her father who was fighting in World War II, right? We also have the Vietnam War in the background, right? Like, and they appear as important parts of a story and of history, right? Like, something to keep in mind is that in comparison to English, in Romance languages like Spanish and actually in German as well, Spanish, French, and German just have one word for story, and it's the same word for history, right? Like Geschichte in German means both story and history. Histoire in French means both history and story. Historia in Spanish means both of them, right? So that what that points out to it is that in the life of somebody, right? How do you measure what events are more important? Historical events, right, or personal events, right? Something that is very important. Like I think something for us that it is actually a good opportunity to reflect about as we're living right now in what we would call a historical moment in our everyday life, in our very everyday story, personal story, right? So I think Corinne made a great point about how Anne Moore's life kind of like makes this even kind of narration of events, right? That makes it gives you more time to think, to contemplate. It's almost like you are like Iggy Pop's song "The Passenger," right? Like you're just like looking through the window of the car, right? Which is an image that we see in Anne Moore's, right? Like if we talk about the first event, right? Like what is the first thing that happens in the series of events, right? Like there's the birth of her, right? It starts with the mention of the father and the birth actually of her sister as well, right? But then what is the event, right? Like that is first, like in the series of events after birth that narrate or describe the story of Anne Moore, which one is the first one, right? And it is that story about Fred, right? Like it is that like very dramatic, like it's almost like a Shakespearean thing. Like suddenly we just say hear that Fred's who was the boyfriend of Suzanne of her sister kills his parents, right? Like, and it is told in this very like dry way, right? Like it is not, the narrator is not like freaking out about it or anything. It's just like this is what happens. And what is Anne Moore? Anne Moore is just a witness in the car, right? And it's kind of like that we are in the story. We're just kind of like a witness, like as Corinne mentioned really well. It's almost like we're at a bar just hearing this guy talk, right? So a lot of events are gonna be like that. Like the same thing happens with when Tony, the husband, kills himself as well, right? Like it is not seen as like this long like reflection on it. It's told rather in a very dry way, right? But I think like the fact that this dryness, as Corinne again mentioned, like does give you extra time to contemplate and to think, and part of it, it doesn't make it like the kind of like let's say fake objectivity of it actually has some sentences that even though they don't seem like to have a lot of like metaphors or you know similes or like literary figures, right? They still kind of like narrate a big emotion, right? Like for example, when we go into the the part about Tony, right? Like, let me see here really quick. That is when, yeah. So like, the sister like is talking to yeah. So on the phone with Anne, it says, Tony's sister raised her voice, but only a little, and said that Tony had committed suicide that morning. Then, without a trace of bitterness in her voice, she asked if Anne would be attending the funeral. Anne said yes, but the next morning, instead of catching a plane to Seattle, she took one that landed a couple of hours later in Mexico City. Tony had died at the age of 22. And then we jump to the next paragraph, right? And it says, during the days Anne spent in Mexico City, our paths might have crossed again, blah, blah, blah. This is the narrator, right? It says, she remembers those days as unreal and dreamlike. Yet, in spite of everything, she had time for sightseeing, right? She went to the museums, blah, blah, blah. And then it says, after 2 months, she took a plane to Seattle and visited Tony's grave. She almost fainted in the cemetery, right? So it's very like a matter of fact narration, but if you like observe it, like it's almost like cinematography, right? Like if you see it and pay attention to it as with a cinematographic eye, like from afar, you see a lot of emotion, right? Like you see like this sister, right? Like calling the ex-wife of the suicide brother, right? And asking something just like first it says like without a trace of bitterness in her voice, right? Like literally there is no a reproach, right? Like the sister doesn't seem to be blaming this woman for leaving Tony and then Tony killing himself, but she does ask, right, if she will come to the funeral, right? Like because it was very important for Tony. Right, like Tony might have killed himself because of the pain of losing her, right? And then it says like Anne said yes, right? So we are like, okay, she's gonna do it. But the next morning, right, like she, instead of going to Seattle, she goes to Mexico City, and it leaves. I think Corinne is really good here at noticing this. Like it makes the reader, it makes you, if you're looking at that scene like a film, like it gives all the weight of the reflection on the emotions onto you, right? Like you picture this woman who's like, okay, I gotta go and see to the funeral of my ex-husband, right? Like, and all the turmoil that could create, and then without like pampering the reader and telling them like you should feel sad about this or anything, without like trying to describe the emotions that the reader should feel, right? If it's a movie, think about it in terms of without playing sad music in order to make you feel sad, it just shows you how she takes a plane to other place, right? So it is like letting the reader to have their own emotions as a reader about this, right? And then it jumps to another paragraph, right? And it tells you like something that seems very matter of fact, but it's not, right? Like this is when maybe the narrator had met her, right? The narrator was very, very anonymous, right? Yet it says she remembers, like from those days, right? Those days as unreal and dreamlike. Yet, in spite of everything, she had time for sightseeing. So that sentence also, like, just gives you a very interesting take on mourning, right? Like, she was kind of in a like out of body experience, out of like just and trying to understand, like, just picture the fact, right? Like, your ex-husband killed himself, right? Only at the age of 22, like a very young guy, right? And then so that creates like this unreality, right? But then in spite of that, like life goes on, like something that Corinne also mentioned, right? So she's just went to a sightseeing, and she doesn't go to any place, right? She goes to visit the city's museums, and almost all of the pre-Columbian ruins is still standing among the buildings and the traffic, right? And think about that in terms of I don't know if you've been to any Latin American city, but like in terms of the history of these places, right? Like when you go to pyramids, what you're seeing are ruins. What you're seeing are the literally kind of like the remains of other lives and other cultures, right? So it's also a very culturally and emotionally significant thing, right? Like so when you're reflecting about the ruins of a relation or like or the a love, right? And then you go and see the ruins of cultures, right? So I think in that sense, Bolaño is really masterful at kind of like, as I said, allowing the reader to have, in very descriptive sentences, a very emotional kind of like space without directing the reader and pampering or like telling how he or she should feel, right? So and I think like yeah, that's kind of the key effect of this story, right? Like, and then even though I agree with Corinne, like there is no like bigger events, right? Like there is no like a climax, right? I still think like the ending of the story is very, in an interesting way, in a new way, kind of like making it giving you a kind of closure on who is Anne Moore and what happened, right? Like it's not, she doesn't die. There's not like a tragedy, like punishment. Like she was sick, right? She might have died. We don't know. There's no clear like punishment. There's no clear like this is what happens, right? There's no moral, right? However, like we get this like last scene where with just two witnesses, right? Like we get this the narrator, who again we don't know much about him except that he had a relation with Anne. He kind of was in love with her, right? But and then yeah, like we hear his voice over and over, and like sometimes he will like kind of put his own thoughts about like, well, I thought like we might have met there, or I would have loved her there, and like she kind of like gets into this like interesting like footnote where she says like, no, we wouldn't, you wouldn't have liked me, right? Like there is some disagreement, even though we don't get to uh, uh, have the complete like take from Anne's point of view, as Corinne mentions, but yet it does allow Bolaños does allow us to hear her voice here and there criticizing our narrator, right? And that's very important. But at the end, I think even though it seems also like very matter of fact, I'm very, very very dry in some way. I'm very like event after event. I think it's like absolutely touching what happens, right? Like because what is the point of this Russian old man, right? Especially in a story where most of the time is about lovers, right? With very difficult situations where like she also has like some sexual frustration, where like she wonders maybe if she can't feel anything with these men. So like it comes up to the point where one of them tries to prostitute her, right? And so on. Like in this kind of like constant, as Corinne said really, really well, like there is this kind of like resisting society as the normative, but also resisting like the view of what a woman is supposed to be. And this is like 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, right? So she was born in 46, I believe. So when she's 40, I got about to like 86, right? So passing through like the whole like baby boomer kind of like idea of the white fence and so on. So at the end, we have a relation that is kind of like it is platonic, right? Like it's just this old man, a Russian, right, who lived in New York, I believe, and at the end, we get the narrator trying to find this old man, right? He has not gotten any letters anymore from Anne, right? I made a point that is was interesting to me, how the last letter that he gets was written actually in Spanish, right? Which is also an interesting point about the whole world mapping that the book tells us, like the story tells us, right? Like where, as Corinne mentioned, and shows of kind of like represents a little bit of Bolaño's own moving through the world, right? And she learned. We read here and there how she was learning Spanish, right? So the last letter that the narrator gets is in Spanish, and it's not an insignificant letter. Like the last letter tells us about Suzanne's suicide, like Anne Moore's sister, right? Who was very present since the beginning, right? Like the first tragedy or event that we learned from Anne Moore's life is the murder that Fred commits, and that's Susan's 15-year-old boyfriend, right? And it tells us how it destroys Susan, right? Susan. While Anne Moore, it says that it doesn't change anything with her, right? So the whole story about Anne Moore's life is also the story about Susan and how they both live their life. We hear about Susan dealing with alcoholism and so on, right? But anyway, just to finish, because I'm already about to get to the 20-minute mark, we end with this moment where the narrator just gets to talk to this Russian, right? And the Russian just, like, the narrator has no more letters, and the Russian has 3 postcards, right? And postcards are very interesting kind of correspondence because it's kind of a pretext, but it's also an image, right? It's a memory of a place, and then with some writing, right? So the narrator gets them, right? And it says, I recognize Anne's handwriting, right? She said the usual things, right? What you will say. And at the end, always she told him to take care of himself and to eat every day, right? This is not a relation anymore that there is like a sexual relation or like a lover's relation. It is just like a platonic, like stranger's relation, and just like being like, hey, like imagine Anne had in all her life and all her worries, like her disease, her sisters and so on, this kind of like random act of kindness towards a stranger, to send him a postcard, like this old man, right? Again, an old man is somebody who's like closer potentially to death, right? Like usually, and just to like remind him to like keep living and like make sure that he's taking care of himself, right? And the story ends with this, right? Like, and it says the last paragraph. The narrator says, "Sadly, curiously, I looked at the Russian. He looked back at me kindly. Have you been following her advice?" I asked. "Of course," he replied. "I always follow a lady's advice," right? Which ends with this like random encounter, sort of, between two men, right? That are just like sharing like a moment, literally, right? Through the pretext of this woman who sent a postcard, right? So it also kind of points out to how narratives and stories are not sometimes not so much about what seems like the main character, as they are not so much as what seems like the main events or the main historical events or the main live events, but about like those little moments, right? And how those little moments and encounters can have way more significance at the end of the day than all the other events, right? So at the end, I think the story is pretty much about events. What kind of events make a life, and how in some way it's all of them, and it's sometimes the most insignificant ones, right? Like Corinne said really well, like how would Anne would have told this story if it was her own voice? It would have been different, right? But the story is kind of like a portrait. It's a portrait of a person made by somebody else, right? Does that make it more legitimate or less legitimate? It just makes it a different story, right? And it's very touching in that way, and I think that's a good reason why to read it. And I think it gives us that space that Corinne was very sharp in pointing out, where we have extra time to contemplate and think about what she's doing and about our own way of measuring things and events. So anyway, I really hope you liked it. It's good. I recommend you read Bolaño. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and then we have our last book coming soon. So stay safe, guys, and yeah, I'll talk to you tomorrow, and have a good night.